Prepare to experience the strongest radio allowable by law. Secrets will be revealed. Myths dispelled. From the studio gym where excuses never apply, it's Superhuman Radio with your host, Carl Lenore.
Welcome back to another episode of Superhuman Radio. I say this with all sincerity. This could possibly be one of the most important shows we do all year, and it's starting out at the beginning of the year. We don't think about dopamine much, and we don't associate it with a lot of problems that people have today, especially as you age. And there's some young people out there that are going to have some issues with dopamine, and it presents itself in all different ways for those who experience this phenomenon. Whether you're young or old, it could present itself as a lack of motivation because dopamine is a prime mover as far as neuroendocrine hormones go in reward. But it also is responsible for movement. I mean, think about Parkinson's disease for a second. This is a deterioration of the substantia nigra portion of the brain, which is a cluster of dopaminergic cells that make my hands move right now. I'm moving my hands because of dopamine. Dopamine is responsible for satisfying erections in men. You may have erectile dysfunction and PDE5 inhibitors don't do anything for you. There's a new drug you're going to be hearing about very shortly called Apomorphine, and it has nothing to do with morphine. It's not an opioid. But it boosts dopamine in the brain. And when taken, if you do have erectile dysfunction, when taken with a PDE5 inhibitor, allows you to have sex. Dopamine is responsible for more satisfying orgasms in both men and women. The list really goes on and on. But we don't think about dopamine. We never think about dopamine when we're confronted with these problems because the pharmaceutical industry goes right to drugs that have nothing to do with the origination of the problem. They don't want to know what's causing the problem. They just want to mask the symptoms. So we're going to talk today about being able to raise dopamine levels on your own without really having to turn to drugs, because a lot of these drugs have really horrible effects. Anybody who knows anybody who's been on drugs for Parkinson's disease knows that those drugs actually progress the illness. They deteriorate the brain. They overpower the brain. They take it hostage, and it's horrible. So we're going to learn today, you and I, because I'm really interested in this discussion about where dopamine comes from, when does it get regenerated, and what can we do to make sure that our brain is creating enough dopamine so that all these wonderful things that it does for us are possible. Before we get started, we always have to thank our title sponsor, and that is Legendary Foods. So when I look at the Tasty Pastry, I get a rush of dopamine right away because I know how good they taste. Tasty Pastry was designed to be a Pop-Tart, but so much more. It is less than 1 gram of sugar, 20 grams of high-quality protein, 4 to 5 net carbs if you're a low-carb keto person. This is in your lane. But the big thing about the Tasty Pastry, and I keep talking about this, is it tastes so amazing that your kids will eat it. Now, those of you with children know you can't get your kids to eat a healthy protein bar instead of a Snickers because it doesn't taste good to them. Well, be prepared. If you bring Tasty Pastries into your home, you're going to have to fight your kids over them because they will want them. And why not send them to school with them? Let them think they're eating the same crap that their friends are, but they're not. Tasty Pastry is the fastest growing, most amazing healthy snack on the market today. People are demanding it in countries. I always get emails from people asking, when will the Tasty Pastry be in the UK? When will the Tasty Pastry be in Canada? Because they've tasted them and they want them. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary. use the code SHR10 to save 10% off tasty pastries plus everything else at the website. Check it out. They have some great seasoned almonds and delicious nut butters that have zero sugar in them. You won't believe it when you taste them. Now let me bring my guest on, and that's Lewis Owen. And I had to ask him how to pronounce his name because it's tricky. It is pronounced Owen. I did say it right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, great. Welcome to the show. Now, you were recommended to me by my good friend, Joel Green. And Joel is amazing. He's brilliant guy. And he told me that you too are brilliant. So we're going to put you to the test today. How's that sound?
That sounds awesome. I'm pumped to be here, Carl.
So where did your fascination with dopamine come? I don't see anyone else talking about dopamine but you.
Yeah, well, I guess my fascination with the neurotransmitter neuromodulator came from studying naturopathy. I was always interested in how we can improve physical and mental performance. And then I quickly realized that the prime neurotransmitter associated with success and dominance and motivation is dopamine. And so I fell down a rabbit hole of all the different ways that we can optimize dopamine and basically how we can leverage all of these tools within our reach to basically just maximize dopamine and give us the greatest chance of success, really.
Okay, interesting. Were you familiar with this new drug that's going to hit the market very short? It's already hitting the markets in small amounts, apomorphine.
Yeah, I did come across some studies on apomorphine back in the day when they were looking at ways to basically induce an erection without even without testosterone and things like that, because it's such a potent dopamine, I think D2 agonist. And so by agonizing that D2 receptor, it's immediately going to suppress prolactin, which we can discuss soon about the relationship there, which, that particular drug does sound pretty fascinating.
Well, and the thing that most people are going to be excited about, because most of us guys, we want sex even when we're older. Like with guys, our desire for sex doesn't just go away with age. With women, it does, because they go through some severe hormonal changes as they move through menopause. And quite often, they don't want to have sex because it's not comfortable. But more importantly, their desire for sex just wanes. It's just not something they think about. I think it was estimated that a man thinks about sex like once every 3 seconds or something ridiculous like that. And I don't know if that's accurate. But when it comes to women, as they age, they don't think about sex at all. And it damages a relationship. And a lot of women will tell you, it's not that I don't want to have sex. It's that I just don't feel like it anymore. It just doesn't the trouble and the work doesn't seem well worth it, So apomorphine has been experimented with women, and it dramatically increases desire spontaneously. Now anytime you manipulate dopamine, there's the chance for nausea. Always. Even Michael J. Fox is on carbidopa and levodopa. They call it Cinemet. If you take a very large dose of that, you'll get nauseous. You'll start sweating, and then it kind of wears off. Dopamine is powerful, powerful, powerful. I can't emphasize this enough. So dialing in the right dose of apomorphine is going to be the challenge for women, but there's no doubt about it. They take it and they want to have sex.
Yeah, I mean, I think that particular pathway has been one that's I guess neglected quite a lot. And when it comes to that desire and the motivation to seek out pleasure, which is dopamine's primary function, basically a lot of people think that dopamine is associated with the pleasure itself, but it's more about the pursuit of pleasure. And what really ties in with that pleasure response is actually mostly mediated through the opioid network. So the opioid network is really what gives us that that consumatory pleasure aspect.
So if you study addiction in the brain, when an addict decides to go and cop, to go and score, to go and get the drug of choice, dopamine rises because of anticipation. And it makes the addict even more laser focused on getting his drug. But more importantly, it creates a euphoria in and of itself before they even get high. So dopamine is very powerful. So all hormones seem to have cyclical nature, pulsatile nature. Is dopamine production cyclical, or is it on demand? How does it work?
Well, in general, in the brain, dopamine levels are actually fairly consistent in terms of its cyclical production. It's not like, let's say, growth hormone that has micro surges throughout the day. Instead, dopamine is actually synthesized from the beginning substrate L-phenylalanine, which is an essential amino acid, which also goes all the way back to why people that go on a low protein diet end up feeling worse mentally. So if we go all the way back and think about the beginning substrate L-phenylalanine, which is an essential amino acid, that then gets converted into L-tyrosine, and then from L-tyrosine into L-dopa, and then from L-dopa into dopamine. But there are many other cofactors involved in that process. So like vitamins B6, zinc, magnesium, and things like that.
So I was going to say, so people could be eating a high protein diet and still be starved for dopamine because it's not making the appropriate conversion, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's jump right into this. In the instance where people are not making dopamine, and it's because they are lacking one of the needed converters or catalysts, if you will. What is it almost always in this day and age? Is it almost always not enough tyrosine? Not, what do you see?
Well, if we have a look at a global population and basically look at which nutrient is most commonly deficient, and I know this nutrient's a bit debated because at high levels it actually accelerates aging, and the nutrient I'm talking about here is iron. Iron, since we know 1 billion people worldwide are deficient in iron, well, iron is absolutely essential to actually convert tyrosine into L-dopa, and then from L-dopa to dopamine. So if we were to look at like what is the rate limiting nutrient, and if we look at the global population, I would say iron's definitely up there. And then also some of the other B vitamins, vitamin B6 would also play a role. And realistically, there are other, nutrients at play that also act, in synergy, in tandem with these two as well.
So iron is an interesting. I've talked about iron for well over a decade on the show. In fact, I am currently in iron overload, and I feel horrible, and I have to start donating blood again. Does the iron have to be unbound if it's in ferritin, if it's in tissue? Is it still going to work on creating dopamine? And also, iron in the brain is now associated with what is called either wet or dry Alzheimer's disease. I think it's dry Alzheimer's disease, but iron is not a great thing. So you've got to manage it, it sounds like, right?
Exactly. And as part of that process there, Carl, what we need to consider is the antioxidant defense of like the brain itself. So whilst iron is degenerative, as in it will accelerate brain aging and even other organs, because iron overload, as I'm sure you're aware, is associated with crazy and oxidative stress.
Right.
Iron itself, though, for anyone that's on the other end of the spectrum who's like basically anemic or extremely low iron, even some women that are post-menopause who suffer from iron deficiency, that by itself, like you can pretty much ask them, like, how do you feel on a daily basis? Do you have motivation? How's your energy? How's your drive? 9 times out of 10, they'll say terrible, and so part of that process is that they're just not synthesizing enough dopamine. And also iron deficiency in some rat studies is associated with decreased expression of the dopamine D2 receptors. So actually getting a decline in these dopamine receptors as well.
So when you talk about B vitamins, you have to talk about the microbiome, right? Because a lot of the B vitamins are actually made in our bodies. We don't have to take them. And that's why if you don't even supplement with B vitamins, your urine is still fairly yellow unless you're super hydrated, and it just be kind of a pale yellow, if you will. So what about the microbiome? What does it contribute, or how does it hamper the production of dopamine?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because just 2 weeks ago, I was looking at the implications of or the effects of stevia and how stevia, the sweetener, can affect the microbiome. And what they found was that stevia could alter the microbiome in a way that causes dysfunction in dopamine synthesis in the mesocorticolimbic area of the brain, which basically means that stevia is causing dysfunctions in the way that we're responding to dopamine in a particular part of the brain associated with reward and pleasure. So that's pretty interesting there. But then also, if we look at some other effects of, the microbiota, as I'm sure you're aware, and most of your listeners would know, 90% of serotonin production begins in, total body is produced in the gut. The same also holds true for dopamine, maybe not as high, but there still appears to be many dopamine. There's dopamine receptors in the gut, and there's also, the gut can also influence dopamine production as well.
So when I've heard this argument about serotonin being produced in the gut, someone sent me a study that implied that the serotonin produced in the gut doesn't make it to the brain, that the brain produces its own serotonin. Is that true?
This is really debatable. I'm under the impression that anything that basically causes gut irritation. So let's say you've eaten some sort of food that's you respond really negatively to, that actually releases it causes irritation in the gut wall, and that actually releases serotonin and also histamine. So, and I'm also under the belief that just because it's produced in the gut, I still believe there's a crosstalk, because, by the way, there's more signals sent from the gut to the brain than from the brain to the gut. There's like 1,000 times more, signaling from the other direction.
Well, and so this is an interesting tangential discussion, but I have promoted this idea that when you crave something, it's actually microbes in your gut producing neurochemicals to tell your brain, take us to Starbucks and get us a cup of coffee. The urge to go and consume even alcohol. In fact, I have a guy that's going to be coming on the show that I did something fantastic with using LL37. But anyway, so we know that the gut is producing messages in the form of chemicals that can either affect the vagus nerve directly or travel up the vagus nerve into the brain and cause the brain to do things. And, and there's a lot of people who want to say, oh, well, the gut is the second brain. It's not. It's a dumb terminal that talks to the brain. And that has been my stance on it for a long time. But so this is interesting that you say that. And so what about hormones? What hormones complement the production? What hormones hurt the production? You said prolactin there for a second. Yeah.
Yeah, so we can start with prolactin. So there is an inverse correlation between dopamine production and prolactin secretion. So to put that simply, prolactin is the hormone that's released following orgasm, and it actually prevents a man from achieving a second erection or the ability to back it up or reload. So men that have very high levels of dopamine tend to be able to reload their erections quicker.
That was me when I was a young man. That was not anymore. I'm 63 now. It doesn't. Again, I'm good for one shot, and then I have to rest.
Yeah, so that's obviously a primary inhibitor of prolactin secretion. But interestingly, there is some research, although as with all things, we think one end of the spectrum is always better, but it's not exactly true. I've seen some research suggesting that men that have supremely and extremely low levels of prolactin actually do not feel a pleasurable orgasm. So they actually think that prolactin's required for a man to feel like a pleasurable orgasm, which is pretty interesting.
Elisa Profumo just said too much information audience.
Yeah.
So when I was on very high doses of testosterone, 2,000 milligrams a week, I obviously my libido was through the roof. So does testosterone help the production of dopamine?
Exactly. There is also a correlation between dopamine, total testosterone production, and dopamine output, and that is why we believe that testosterone is such a powerful productivity and get shit done hormone, because it's so closely correlated to dopamine synthesis. And I'm sure at 2,000 milligrams per week, I mean,
Oh,
damn,
I was getting shit done. I was. So this is fascinating. So I guess a strategy to improve dopamine production should include something that mildly suppresses prolactin.
Yeah. So in terms of doing that, obviously there's many different ways that we can like directly and indirectly lower prolactin. But interestingly, the way that I perceive prolactin is similar to how I perceive cortisol, in that both cortisol, prolactin, parathyroid hormone, these are actually stress related hormones. And in fact, I would also lump in serotonin, because we know that people that go on antidepressants, for example, SSRIs, which in my opinion they can be potentially devastating. They can lead to, major increases in prolactin, and hence they literally lose their libido. And even after going on antidepressants, there's something known as post SSRI sexual dysfunction, which even after stopping the antidepressant, many people are still having sexual side effects for years after cessation.
That's so sad, and they're so readily prescribed today. It's really sad. So I remember when using certain drugs, I think it was trenbolone, used to raise prolactin levels dramatically. And I think I took something called cabergoline. Cabergoline, am I pronouncing it right?
Yeah.
So what is that, and how would one use it if they wanted to gently suppress prolactin? If they suspect that their gut's a little screwy and they think that they may be producing too much prolactin?
Well, cabergoline is usually like the first line of treatment in terms of directly inhibiting prolactin, because it is a powerful dopamine D2 agonist, but it's also a 5-HT2B agonist, which is associated with fibrosis. That's why there's an increased risk of fibrosis with cabergoline. So instead, what I like to look at are some of these other underground nootropics that have dopaminergic regenerative properties. Instead of being so aggressive and directly agonizing that dopamine D2 receptor, instead, what about working on, using a drug, which one of my favorite drugs for this particular area is called Bromantane. And Bromantane basically upregulates the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase. So you're getting more tyrosine to eventually go to L-dopa and then dopamine.
So you could take that along with some tyrosine, and there would be more donor available to make more. Do people feel when their dopamine is going up? I mean, like I said before about Cinemet and all that stuff, it'll actually make you nauseous and a little anxious for a little while. When people start dialing the things that we're talking about in today, do they notice it?
Yeah, I mean, the most acute effects that people will notice will be an increase in mental clarity, because dopamine, speeds up mental processes, but then also just better resilience, better motivation, and perhaps even better focus, like the ability to sort of dial in and lock onto a particular task.
Is caffeine abuse something that eventually starts to cause dopamine to drop?
Well, caffeine is it's a typical stimulant. And as with most stimulants, they basically borrow from tomorrow. That's how I look at it. Like they're basically borrowing from the future. And so with caffeine, the best way to sort of use that, I would perceive that as something you'd need to consider as a consistent part of your regime, instead of this stop starting aspect. can lead to, that period of sort of withdrawal. Whereas things like, bromantane, phenylalanine, like none of these are associated with any sort of withdrawal or sort of side effects as well.
Yeah. The class we're talking about are methylxanthines. And I've always I abused caffeine for many years. I'm talking about stupidly ridiculous high amounts, 1,000, 1,300, 1,500 milligrams a day, pre and post workout, and then throughout the day. And I feel that I don't have the dopamine production that I should because of what you said. I borrowed from tomorrow to fuel today. And I feel like now that I'm not using any, the only thing I do is I drink some black tea once in a while, and that's it. And now as a result of that, I kind of feel like it's going to take me a while to have my dopamine levels come back because I have had my foot on that gas pedal for a decade. Are there ways to what's the word, rescue somebody like me?
There is one particular nootropic that I tend to actually recommend to people that have abused heavy stimulants like chronically. And that's one that also massively affected my cognition and my just mental capacity. And I started using it a long time ago, probably like 4 or 5 years ago. It's a compound known as Uridine Monophosphate.
Yeah, I've heard
And uridine for me is like the go-to stimulant resetter because it can work on increasing potassium evoked dopamine release and then also upregulate the dopamine D2 receptors. And if you look at some of the rat studies, there is a potentiation effect when they combine uridine with psychostimulants. So it actually massively increases the power of stimulants. So you can actually come back and drink, use a lower dose and still get the same effect, basically.
What do you mean by psycho stimulants? What class are you talking about here?
Well, they lump in amphetamines and also like dopamine releasing agents, DRAs, and dopamine reuptake inhibitors as well into that sort of family.
Doesn't maca root increase dopamine production?
Yeah.
Is it good? Is it effective?
It is, and I'm glad you brought that up because maca is. A lot of people think that maca directly increases testosterone, which is, it's obviously it's prescribed to increase libido, but I'm glad you brought that up because the mechanism by which it increases sex drive and libido.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you have to take maca root prolonged period of time? Does it accumulate its effects, or is it something that acutely works the first time you take it?
Usually maca is one of those herbs that has a pretty fast onset. So between 1 to 3 days, people tend to notice. But if we're looking from a like a sperm count and fertility and ejaculation load, you'd have to increase, consume maca for weeks for that sort of effect.
You know the best thing, if a man out there feels like he's not producing enough man yogurt, the best thing to use is lecithin.
Yeah.
Lecithin. Just get yourself some lecithin granules at your favorite hippie health food store, and take a tablespoon a day, and watch what happens in about a week. Watch.
Yeah.
But tell your partner before, just so that they're ready for the avalanche. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but before we do that, I want to plug Lewis's the best place to go and find Lucas. I'm sorry, Lucas Aoun is to go to youtube.com/boost your biology, and he's got some great stuff. I was just checking it out. I'm going to go check out some of his videos. So that's where you go to meet up with him. He's got a lot of good stuff up there. You'll probably spend the whole day skipping from one to another of his videos. We're going to take one quick commercial break. We'll be right back with more. Stay tuned. One of the best health hacks there is using an infrared sauna with regularity. But infrared saunas are expensive. You have to assemble them, and they require a great deal of space in your home to dedicate to one. But that's all about to change because I negotiated an amazing deal with Helix, the infrared sauna blanket company, so that every one of my listeners can take advantage of an infrared sauna in their home, apartment, condo, wherever you live. Take it with you. Right now, you can get an infrared sauna blanket for just $469. And if you want, you can break it into 4 interest-free installment payments as well. There is no longer an excuse not to have and use an infrared sauna. Go to shrnetwork.biz/helix. That's HEALIX. Use code SHR. Get this ridiculously inexpensive price now and 45-day risk-free. If you don't like it, send it back. But I promise you, you will love it and you will never want to be without it ever again. Verso contains potent compounds proven to increase NAD+. NAD+ is arguably the most important molecule in the body, and without it, you would die in less than 30 seconds. It's responsible for a number of physiological processes, one being that it guides longevity genes called sirtuins to direct cells in the body to perform their jobs. NAD+ levels drop with age, and when they're low, there isn't enough to guide sirtuins, so your cells start to break down. This explains why the body ages and consequently wrinkles appear. There is less benefit to exercise, it takes longer to recover, and an older body is not resilient like a young body. Start reversing biological age now. Go to shrnetwork.biz/verso and use the code SHR for 20% off plus free shipping on your bottle of Verso today. If you've listened to Superhuman Radio for any length of time, you know I'm a big proponent of peptides. One of my favorites is GHKCU, the blue copper peptide. It has the ability to repair and regenerate more youthful expression of skin cells, reversing the signs of aging. Restore Cell's stem cell awakening serum, along with their other products, contains potent formulations of blue copper peptides and only the highest quality organic ingredients. Superhuman Radio listeners can now save 25% site-wide. Go to shrnetwork.biz/blue and use the code SHR25. Remodel your skin today. Have you been struggling to achieve results in the gym? Trouble sleeping through the night? Overwhelmed with stress or anxiety? Look no further than Infiniwell supplements. They have designed products to address specific needs like muscle growth, hormone balance, sleep, and anxiety from the first use. Infiniwell helps you live well. Go to shrnetwork.biz/bewell. That's BEWELL and use code SHR20 and start living well today.
Dogs should be powered by fat and protein, not carbs. That's why Visionary Pet makes low-carb, ketogenic dog food for dogs of all breeds and life stages. From kibble to freeze-dried and even low-carb treats, all Visionary Pet recipes are very low-carb, ketogenic, and made with 100% real meat protein. Shop now and use code SHR for 20% off your first order today. Your dog deserves the lifelong benefits of optimal nutrition. Make the switch to Visionary and see why smart dogs eat low carb.
If you'd like a shortcut to better sleep, more energy, and calmer, more stable moods, then you should make sure you're supplementing with magnesium daily. Let me tell you why. About 75% of people are magnesium deficient. This deficiency can lead to higher levels of anxiety, irritability, trouble sleeping, and low energy. It can even contribute to foot and leg cramps while you sleep. Magnesium Breakthrough by Bioptimizers is the single best magnesium supplement in the world. Simply take 2 capsules before you go to bed, and you'll be amazed by the improvements in your mood and energy levels and how much more rested you feel when you wake up. I take Magnesium Breakthrough every night and I sleep better because I use it. Go to magbreakthrough.com/SHR and use the code SHR10 during checkout to save 10% off and get free shipping. Check it out.
You're listening to the Superhuman Channel. We're ripped and we're ready.
Hey, welcome back. We're talking with Lucas Aoun. Owen. I want to say Aoun, but it's just Owen, right? Like that's how I should pronounce it.
Well, technically, you're actually right. It's actually Aoun, but it's I always just say Owen because it's hard to pronounce.
Yeah, I know. Us Americans, we can't pronounce any of the names but American names. So, Lucas, let me. I have a lot of questions here. Are there diets that predispose people to better production of dopamine? Or diets to stay away from? Obviously, it sounds like the vegan diet is not a good idea.
Absolutely, the vegan diet's lacking a lot of these amino acids. But if we were to look into like tailored diets specifically to optimize dopamine, the way that I would go about it would actually be a diet that's highly correlated with higher testosterone. So we're looking at a diet that's rich in, monounsaturated fats, rich in a lot of organ meats, liver, kidneys, hearts. These have all of the building blocks for testosterone, rich in cholesterol, rich in selenium, rich in zinc. And then also, obviously, we want to be avoiding very high GI foods and obviously processed foods. So, because as we know, anything that worsens insulin resistance is also associated with poor production of dopamine.
I think Dr. Oh God, I'm going to forget her name. I just was about to say her name and then it went out. Stephanie Seneff has been on the show talking about glyphosate. And I don't think you guys use glyphosate in Australia, Roundup, for genetically modified crops. But I recall her talking about glyphosate making changes to the microbiome that impair the production of dopamine. Do you know anything about that?
Oh, geez. The only thing I know with glyphosate is the fact that it can just deplete and strip the body of key nutrients. And so maybe because it depletes manganese, perhaps it has I know that manganese deficiency is also associated with low dopamine. But yeah, that would make sense, though, affecting the microbiome.
What about sleep, right? Is part of disrupted sleep or short sleep phenomenon, is part of it the lack of dopamine production, or maybe even the lack of dopamine being able to dock in receptors and do its job?
Well, from like a sleep perspective, I mean, any sort of sleep deprivation is going to exacerbate any sort of neurodegenerative disease. We know that excessive sleep loss is associated with increased amyloid plaque, but I haven't looked into the research, but it wouldn't surprise me if severe sleep deprivation also exacerbates or increases the risk of developing Parkinson's as well.
Yeah, no, I know. It's amazing. And Alzheimer's disease, because fragmented sleep has been linked to Alzheimer's disease. That's why people who have obstructive sleep apnea tend to develop Alzheimer's disease sooner. Does meditation do anything for the brain and the production of dopamine?
Well, meditation is known to increase, brown matter in the brain. And so it's actually, I'm glad you brought this up because there is a correlation between, I did a video on my YouTube channel talking about the relationship between dopamine and self-awareness and how dopamine can increase introspective behaviors. So the ability to remove yourself from a situation and actually perceive yourself, oh, how am I being perceived in this situation? That's pretty interesting there in terms of how dopamine can tie into self-awareness.
It's funny you say that. Michael Silva, who works for Legendary Foods, posted something on Instagram the other day. And it was very fascinating. I'm going to summarize it. But basically it said they took a jar and they put red ants and black ants in it, and they coexisted perfectly. And then someone started shaking the jar. And once they shook the jar, then the red ants blamed the black ants, and and they started to fight, and they started to kill each other from this. And I remember messaging him back and saying, isn't it sad that most humans they have the self-awareness of an ant? Like, in other words, right now we have governments shaking our jar and we're fighting with each other. You know what I mean? And it's like, so you talk about self-awareness. I think that there could be a political effect to getting people's dopamine levels elevated so they stop being douchebags. But that's fascinating. So what about psychedelics? Like, I like to microdose with shrooms. And my microdose is 0.5 gram, by the way. And I feel very focused. They say you have to take 3 grams to trip. 0.5 gram just puts me in this zone, but I'm not trippy or anything like that. Do you think there's any benefit to this whole dopamine production, D2, D1 receptor, blah, blah, blah? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to psychedelics in particular, looking at like, let's say, psilocybin and its metabolite or sister psilocin, when we look at these particular psychedelic drugs, so what they actually tend to do is they act as an agonist at the 5-HT2A receptor. And so what that leads to is a downstream release of dopamine and also glutamate. So it wouldn't surprise me though if some people, miscorrelate the energizing and stimulatory effects of a microdose with dopamine. They think it's like mediated through dopamine, but I think what they're actually experiencing is a massive increase in neurogenesis, which I'm sure that's obviously part of its antidepressant mechanism, but then also having that increase in glutamate. And this is why, for example, S-ketamine is now being used as an antidepressant because it actually increases glutamate. And glutamate is also associated with excitation.
Simulation. I remember back in the day when Accent first came out, monosodium glutamate. I'm going back to the 70s now. There were children who, if their parent, like they were sensitive to it, like when the mother used Accent to tenderize meat or season foods, like the kid would bounce off the walls the whole night long, and that's because of the increase in glutamate production in the brain. Interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely tied in there. And as part of that, obviously, when we compare something like MSG to, let's say, ketamine or, for example, psilocybin, whilst they both increase glutamate, MSG does it in such a reckless way. It's so powerfully increases dopamine that it causes, glutamate, that it causes neurotoxicity and cell death, and that excitatory effect leads to the following day a bit of an actual crash, a come down effect.
Well, and we see that in people who use large doses of MDMA or Molly or ecstasy, whatever you want to call it. They for lack of better terms, their serotonin receptors are so overwhelmed that when it wears off, they can actually be depressed for 2, 3, 4 days at a time, because it's like their serotonin level went from super physiological to like non-existent, and then they just and so they have to take more Molly to feel good again.
Yeah, I think there is some research that also indicates that there is some semi-permanent changes to the dopamine system following abuse of like MDMA and some of the party drugs like that. So even though some people think that they come back to baseline like 3-4 days later, realistically, they've actually dropped their baseline slightly down every time they abuse these sort of drugs.
Yeah, and that makes sense, because that same thing happens with sex hormones when you use anabolic steroids. So the College of London has been doing a ongoing study. Maybe you're aware of it. They're using microdoses of MDMA to treat major depressive disorder with great success. You're talking about abuse, but they're using it like a therapeutic. Is there a difference in those two approaches?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad you mentioned this, because obviously the dose makes the poison. And so a very low dose may be able to alter the default mode network enough to shake them out of their learned helplessness mindset. So that sort of makes sense. They're sort of leveraging MDMA's like ability to increase serotonin and to alter their learned helplessness state. And so by doing so, without causing severe neurotoxicity, just enough to get them out of that that repetitive loop sort of state.
The terminology you just used fascinated me, and literally, like, I had like an epiphany just now. I've never thought of depression and or anxiety, which generally coexist, as learned helplessness. That is a fascinating crystallization of what's really going on. I know it's not in the main topic here, but expand on that. Learned helpless. Like this is something that usually happens as a child. If you live in a household where maybe your parents are alcoholics, or you feel like that there's a lot of instability, you learn to be helpless then.
Exactly. And so what I tend to do is I actually correlate trauma with learned helplessness, because that particular state is a state characterized by repetitive thoughts, feeling like they can't escape, like they're the victim, and in general, just not having hope. They can't see light at the end of the tunnel. But what you'll actually find is, if we manipulate their neurotransmitters, for example, if we massively decrease serotonin and shift the ratio in the balance more towards dopamine, all of a sudden that person can see light at the end of the tunnel. And there is hope. There is they're thinking about the future, but when they're stuck in that sort of learned helplessness state, they can't even think, weeks ahead. They're literally just stuck in the now. They can't even get out of that sort of state.
So those of us who are hyper optimists, we obviously have high dopamine, is what it sounds like.
Yeah. I mean, because dopamine's all about obviously building, creating, being more productive. And so like those that are more optimistic and look at the glass as like half full instead of being half empty, they're pro, like, their mindset is geared towards like there is more hope. They have better resilience, the better adaptability and things like that.
It's funny. Like all of us, we've all been through so many different traumatic events and challenges in our lives. If you live long enough, you're going to be through a lot of them. And I used to describe myself. I've always been a hyper optimist. I'm not someone who is involved in magical thinking. I don't believe if I watch The Secret that I'm going to become wealthy, and if I put pictures on a wall, I'm going to obtain those things. They can help me be vigilant and focus on my goals, but there's no magic in that, and I don't believe in that. But when describing my hyper enthusiasm and optimism, I once said that I'm like a junkyard dog, and it's in the middle of winter, and I'm sleeping out in the snow, and I go to sleep thinking, well, maybe tomorrow they'll let me in. They'll let me in the house. Like tomorrow will be better tomorrow. And I've always been that way. And that's just that's interesting. I never thought about the level of dopamine being the precursor to that kind of an attitude. That's really fascinating. So look, we're going to help a lot of people with this show, because we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to ask you to kind of summarize a plan. Like, how can my audience take X steps and elevate their dopamine production so that they can be more enthusiastic, they can be more aggressive with their lives, they can have better sex and relationships and all that sort of stuff. So we're going to take a break. Before we do that, I just want to put up your YouTube channel again, and it is youtube.com/boostyourbiology. Very easy to remember. Lucas Aoun. How's that? Good? Aoun.
Perfect.
And we're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Stay with us. Remember those rectangular toaster pastries you used to love when you were a kid? Well, Legendary Foods has just made them better. The new cake-style tasty pastry is like nothing you've ever had before. With 20 grams of high-quality protein and less than 1 gram of sugar, you'll feel like you're cheating, but you're not. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary and use the code SHR10 to save 10% off your purchase of tasty pastries. Now available in cookies and cream, red velvet cake, birthday cake, blueberry, strawberry, brown sugar cinnamon, and hot fudge sundae. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary and use code SHR10 today. If you've listened to this show for any length of time, you know that I have struggled to give up coffee for years. Coffee has destroyed my gut and it's impaired my health. Well, I haven't had coffee in months thanks to a product called Magic Mind. Magic Mind is the first nootropic blend I actually feel working. One shot and I'm good all day long. My memory is crystal clear and I'm able to function and have great focus without coffee or caffeine for that matter. If you want to try a product that really works, if you're like me and you want to give up coffee forever, or you just need something occasionally that will help you lift the brain fog, Magic Mind is your product. I promise you that this product you will feel when you use it. Go to shrnetwork.biz/magic Magic Mind, all one word, and use the code SHR for a whopping 20% off your first order. I would easily say that I am the hugest proponent you will ever meet to doing anything that will improve the quality of my sleep. And that's because sleep is linked to just about every metabolic disorder we see in our population today. One of the easiest things you can do to improve the quality of your sleep is to get a pillow that can be shaped into the exact form factor that allows you to get your best night's sleep. And that is MyPillow. I've been sleeping with MyPillow for a few years now, and I can tell you that when I have to travel and stay in hotels, I don't get a good night's sleep because I don't have MyPillow with me. Right now, you can save up to 60% off of everything offered to improve the quality of your sleep at shrnetwork.biz/MyPillow when you use the code SHR. Or you can call toll-free 800-889-4938. And remember to use code SHR to save up to 60% off of everything at their website. If you've listened to Superhuman Radio for any length of time, you know I'm a big proponent of peptides. One of my favorites is GHK-Cu, the blue copper peptide. It has the ability to repair and regenerate more youthful expression of skin cells, reversing the signs of aging. Restore Cell's stem cell awakening serum, along with their other products, contains potent formulations of blue copper peptides and only the highest quality organic ingredients. Superhuman Radio listeners can now save 25% site-wide. Go to shrnetwork.biz/blue and use the code SHR25. Remodel your skin today. C60, also known as Buckminster fullerene, is the most powerful, most versatile antioxidant in the world. It's been shown in studies to double the lifespan of rodents. We all know the importance of taking antioxidants to slow aging, reduce inflammation, and improve mitochondrial function and energy production. But there are literally hundreds of antioxidants that would cost you thousands of dollars to take every day. I take one. I take C60 from C360 Health. Revive and Rejuvenate are two blends that harness the power of C60. Don't waste another minute. Go to shrnetwork.biz/revive and use the code SHR for 15% off and free shipping inside the United States today. Being superhuman means being conscientious about the choices we make. White Oak Pastures is superhuman when it comes to raising livestock. They're committed to animal welfare, land regeneration, and rural revival. They responsibly manage the entire process from the pasture to your doorstep. High-quality, pasture-raised, great-tasting meat from a farm you can trust. Full nose-to-tail selections. They even have options for your pet. Go to shrnetwork.biz/white oak and use the code SUPERHUMAN to save 10% off your entire first order.
This is the Superhuman Channel. Evolution just got kicked up a notch.
Hey, welcome back. We're talking with Lucas Aoun. I'm going to get it right. You're going to have to come back on the show a couple times until I get it right. And we're talking about dopamine production. And I know a lot of people may not think this is a sexy topic. Oh, Carl, who cares? Believe me, you could be suffering from issues today that are all rooted in your ability for your brain to both produce and interact with dopamine. And don't you want to feel better? Don't you want to feel like, we did shows about oxytocin. People who hug 8 times a day are more satisfied with their lives. Why? Because human touch, an embrace from someone you care about, produces oxytocin. Well, along with oxytocin being a feel-good chemical, dopamine is probably more important at the end of the day, again, because it plays so many different roles besides bonding. So let's see. We have a couple questions here we're going to get to first. First of all, I got to give a shout out to Nella Marina because I said to people, if you just say hello, we'll give you a shout out and you'll be immortalized in today's show. Craig Hollander, who is a friend of the show, says there are more neurons in the gut than in the brain, and that's true. Of course, we know that Elisa said I was giving out too much information about my current state of sexuality. Cola Quench says, who's watching on YouTube, if time for questions, are there any strategies to mitigate post-sex prolactin directly? Cabergoline does work for this for me, but are there bad side effects? Well, he must have missed that there are side effects, and you have better strategies, right, for that one?
Yeah, good question from Cola Quench. So with if we were to mitigate that post-sex prolactin rise, we can do that without using cabergoline. So instead, what I like to lean towards is a stack. So, for example, using about 500 milligrams of L-phenylalanine, because that directly is a precursor, and then stacking that with, let's say, about 25 milligrams of bromantane, which is that molecule that compound that I mentioned before, and then also adding in like a really small amount of like vitamin E sublingually. That sort of stack by itself will be enough to lower prolactin and just basically help you to reload and sort of still be in the mood to sort of go again.
And then let's see here. Craig Hollander says learned helplessness happens when people or animals become conditioned to believe that a bad situation is unchangeable or inescapable. Kind of like the hysteria we've had in the world since COVID-19. I mean, wow. Everybody's I look, I'm not vaccinated. I'm not getting vaccinated, but that's my own choice. I don't fault anybody who gets vaccinated, but it's like, I'm not helpless. I'm fine. Yeah, I agree with that. And Sean Wasson, a longtime friend of the show, says, great show. Thank you. We will have Lucas back on. I promise you that, because I've got lots more questions. He's got lots of great. And then Cola Quench did say he's going to try.
Awesome.
Thank you very much. That stack was probably what we're going to talk about now anyway, right? Like, so, okay, I want to optimize my dopamine production. And maybe just optimizing my dopamine production is more than adequate, because if my dopamine overpowers prolactin, I don't have to worry about suppressing it. Give me some steps. Give us here's what you do.
So if I were to design like a superhuman dopamine stack, this is what I would consider. So as I mentioned, very similarly with the other guy before, L-phenylalanine would absolutely be a part of that stack, because it's a precursor. It's, acts as a substrate for dopamine synthesis. Then, of course, I would need to make sure that the individual has all the adequate nutrients. As I mentioned, all of the B vitamins are essential, B1, B2, B3, B6. And then also what I would do is focus on that tyrosine hydroxylase enzyme, because that is the rate limiting.
That's the limiting factor. That's the limiting factor.
Exactly. Yeah. So there are ways we can upregulate that. One way that is actually used quite a lot as a fat burner is actually forskolin. Are you familiar with?
Yeah, coleus forskolin, right?
Yeah, and coleus forskolin is although it's used as a fat burner because it increases thyroid hormone output, it also increases free testosterone. It actually also upregulates this tyrosine hydroxylase enzyme. And anyone with, also correlating there is anyone with high thyroid hormone output, they also tend to have better dopamine signaling, because T3 is also associated with better dopamine transmission. So if we sort of go back to that, so phenylalanine, forskolin, addressing the B vitamins, and then bringing in some like other research chemicals, such as, let's say, the one that I mentioned before, bromantane, which is the world's first synthetic adaptogen. So bromantane is originally used for cosmonauts, athletes, and basically what it does is, as a compound, it basically upregulates that that tyrosine hydroxylase mRNA expression. So we're getting like a semi-permanent increase in total dopamine production.
Okay, so since you said bromantane, I'm wondering about other things, like some of these injectable peptides that we have now, that Penelon, Epitalon, and then I have to think about, what about melatonin? Does melatonin production help or hurt dopamine production?
Well, the way that I perceive melatonin is basically as it's a potent antioxidant in the brain, and perhaps one of the strongest antioxidants in the brain. But melatonin acutely is going to be, basically going to lower dopamine production. There's actually anti-dopamine effects of melatonin, but that makes sense because we don't want dopamine before bed. Yeah.
Right. How about epitalon? Do you know anything about epitalon and pinolon, the injectable peptides?
I've researched them a little bit from their like longevity perspective. They're quite good. There is another drug that just came to my mind that I forgot to mention. Is called Celegiline. Are you familiar
Oh
with?
yeah, they give it to
Yeah.
people. They give it to Parkinson's disease. Yes.
Yeah, and Celegiline is associated with longer lifespan in some of these animal studies. But Celegiline is a MAO-B, monoamine oxidase B inhibitor. So if you were to combine like it's a, Celegiline, phenylalanine, bromantane, and then massively lower serotonin with a drug called Cyproheptadine. Are you familiar with?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
It's that one there at a really micro dose, which I personally use maybe once a week or so at about 250 micrograms. It's one of the most potent anti-serotonin drugs on the market, and it's very obvious when you take it. You sleep really well. You wake up the next day with like literally zero anxiety, and you just feel crystal clear the next day.
So you take it once a week. What's the half-life?
It's got a 8-hour half-life, but it's not. I'm not so much fixated on the half-life.
The metabolites of what it does. Yeah.
Yeah, and also what it's doing to some of the serotonin receptors. It actually down-regulates like the 5-HT2A receptor. It can upregulate the 5-HT1A. And by doing this, and this is a drug that I've now used 60, 70 times now, like across my lifespan. I know exactly what I get from a microdose. I know how it's going to affect me 3 days later, 4 days later. It really is for me like the ultimate like reset drug. It's not a drug that you like because it makes you super hungry, really fatigued. But at a microdose, it's really good to like lower basal levels of serotonin.
Interesting. I mean, if you don't have problems with serotonin, just focus on raising your dopamine anyway. I mean, that's going to be more than enough.
Yeah. Yep.
Fascinating stuff. I'm sure there were other questions I wanted to get into. Craig Hollander is talking about prolactin, which is promoted by estrogen and inhibited by progesterone. Increases with stress and with age. Well, stress increases with age. You know what I mean? So that's really part of that conundrum. So what about just taking we've done shows, and I have occasionally used transdermal progesterone before bed because it does induce sleep. But you got to dial in your dose because otherwise you could start getting groggy in the morning. What about just using progesterone to help kind of push prolactin down?
Well, progesterone's, whilst it's quite effective at doing that, for some guys they can get a like a numbing effect. You're probably familiar with, because that numbing.
Yeah, it's not the greatest thing in the world, and that's why I stopped using it because it had and I started holding water, and the only thing I could attribute it to was that, and so I stopped, and then the water weight went away. And I just want to put this up there because the people who listen to the podcast can't see these things. Not a pro who is watching on YouTube said, I had no idea dopamine did so much. Awesome guests, great information for the layperson. Thank you.
Awesome.
Dopamine does so much. It's ridiculous. And nobody talks about it. When Lucas and I started communicating and Elisa gave me the menu of things that you like to talk about, I was like, oh, dopamine, that's it. Because especially with the research I started doing on apomorphine and libido and erectile dysfunction, I was like, oh man, you may not even need a PDE5 inhibitor. You may need to raise your dopamine levels.
Yeah, there's definitely it's a fascinating topic because obviously like it gets neglected because there are not many like doctors that tend to look specifically, they just ignore it. They just think it's all serotonin mediated, but it's usually not the case.
Is it possible? I know there's neurotransmitter assays that they do at some of these doctors' offices, but I've never believed they work because what's in your blood is not what's in your brain. Are there any ways to test dopamine levels in humans?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of people ask me, like, how do we assess, neurotransmitter status? the problem is we do these these blood analysis and also these urine analysis. The main issue with those is that it doesn't accurately give us an idea of the dopamine and serotonin and GABA production in the specific parts of the brain. It's not about like total maybe body-wide metabolites and excretion, all that stuff. What's more important are like which region of the brain and also the enzymes that degrade these neurotransmitters and also like the receptor sites. So unfortunately, I think we're quite far away from being able to accurately, scan someone's brain and be able to like say, okay, you've got low GABA here, high serotonin here. Like it's just not going to happen. So I guess the next best thing to do would be, and I'm sure you've probably done it yourself, is like the Braverman neurotransmitter.
Oh yeah,
test.
I remember that dopamine dominant. I was dopamine dominant. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same. So
Eric Braverman, I haven't heard from him in a long time. I had him on the show probably 15 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, I haven't heard from him in a long time. Really good guy. And he's aging very well. If anybody sees what he looks like now, he's really aging well. He looks great. I think he's like in his 70s now, and he looks like he's 40.
Wow.
Yeah. So he knows something. I made a meme one time with a big fat physician, and he had like a stain from food on his tie, and he had his stethoscope on. And I said, never trust a fat doctor, because like what is he going to teach you? What is he going to tell you? How to become fat and sick? But Eric Braverman, I would trust, because he looks great. He looks great. All right. Well, look, this has been fantastic. Thank you for getting up so early to do the show, because I know it's still early in the morning where you are in Australia. And I promise we will have you back on because you have some fascinating topics. I'm going to tell people one more time, go to youtube.com/boostyourbiology to learn more about Lucas and let him know you learned about him here on Superhuman Radio. Take care, brother. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for having me, Carl. Thanks, man.
Thank you. All right, and that's it for today. We will see you tomorrow with more Superhuman Radio. Don't forget, share the show. I have it on good authority from the Pope that if you share this show and it helps somebody, you're going to heaven. So there you go. Share the show. We'll see everybody tomorrow with more Superhuman Radio. Thanks for being here.